we are a San Francisco-based advocacy organization that does three things. The first is really focusing on education, getting people to understand how climate connects to how the climate crisis and human rights are connected to fashion. The second is our work around transparency. It's really hard as an everyday customer to know who are the better brands, who are the brands that are causing a lot of environmental damage and human rights abuses. And so we rate brands, and on our platform, remake.world, you can discover better brands. And finally, a lot of the work that we do is making the industry more just and accountable by pushing for smart regulation and building coalitions around sustainable businesses and the labor movement. So all that to say, it's, the ultimate goal is to make fashion a force for good. I myself have a 15-year history of working in this industry. I work both on the inside with fashion brands and on the policy side. And I realized what we need is a way for everyday people to take action to make this industry more just.
Wonderful. And so a 15-year trajectory in fashion, but from what I understand, Remake's about 5 years old. Is that right? Can you share a little bit as to what brought us here and what had you feel that something like Remake was needed in the world of fashion?
Yeah. So, I started my career very starry-eyed after a degree in public policy to say, if I just make the business case for fashion brands, we're going to make a difference. And, it was great to work on the inside of the industry, but here's an industry that's mostly deregulated, where you don't have a lot of incentives for the industry to be thinking about the climate crisis or addressing the sweatshop conditions. And so when I was working with the UN, the International Labor Organization, it was a time when Rana Plaza fell down. This was the biggest industrial disaster of our lifetime. Multi-story building collapsed. It took days to pull out. The garment makers were predominantly women of color out of the wreckage. And, there had been a few different disasters back to back. The Tazreen fire had happened, Ali Enterprise in my hometown of Karachi. And so I just thought, enough, how long are people going to essentially have to lose their lives and dignity in our quest for cheap clothes? And I realized that there was really a gap in terms of all of us as everyday citizens having a seat at the table. And that's really the founding story of Remake. I had had enough of trying to make change on the inside and wanted to do something more disruptive from the outside.
And so how do we feel so far about the journey into Remake? Are you glad that we're enduring on this journey?
Absolutely. Never to sugarcoat an entrepreneurial journey is not without its bumps. When you work inside a established organization, there's all kinds of things, wages, benefits that are all taken care of. And now as the CEO and at the helm of, a startup organization, I have all kinds of headaches I have to learn about, right? Accounting, compliance with different regulations, making sure my team is paid fairly. So fundraising, all of that. But I will tell you, it's been very freeing to be on this advocacy journey. I'm fueled every day by the young changemakers, our ambassador community in universities across the United States, as well as fashion professionals that are a part of the network. So many of them send us messages saying how timely our education assets are, how eye-opening, how it's really changed their interaction and relationship with their clothes. And so for me, that's very galvanizing, getting the next generation of people who are coming into their customer power to be thinking about the climate crisis, to be thinking about human rights abuses. And on the other side, a lot of the work that we do is with unions and women in who make our clothes in the fashion industry. And I'm just always amazed at the fierceness with which the people who make our clothes are constantly advocating to have more dignified work, to have fair wages, to have safe working conditions. And so far it's been a very fun to build this kind of coalition. We're still young, I'd say, in our journey as a startup, but mature enough to have some lessons learned along the way. And it's the first time really I've been in an all-women team. And that has been really fun as well.
Well, incredibly important work. I'll certainly attest to that, doing my due diligence beforehand and learning about all the extensive things that y'all take on at Remake. But Ayesha, just to make sure that we set the stage here properly and get us all onto the same page, can you explain a little bit as to what is the current climate and status of the working conditions for garment workers in the fashion industry? We'll get into a couple important milestones that did happen recently. I think one as recent as yesterday, at least at the time of this recording. But I'd love for you to set a bit of a stage for us in context so that we all know, what are the issues at hand here in fashion that really inspired much of the work that you do at Remake in the first place.
Yeah, sometimes when I talk to people, there's almost a visceral reaction. Either you'll hear from folks, oh my gosh, I love fashion, but I didn't know that there was this underbelly of ugliness, right? And then you hear the opposite from folks who are like, well, I don't really care about fashion, so I don't really see how this relates to me. And the thing is, we all wear clothes, right, for the most part. And so as long as we wear clothes and clothe our families, we have a stake in this industry and a connection to it, whether we like it or not. And the thing is, the way fashion is produced today is fundamentally different than it was even 15 to 20 years ago. You think about our grandmother's generation, they were buying very few clothes that were durably made, that lasted a long time. And with the advent of fast fashion and ultra fast fashion, what we have come to view clothes is as essentially disposable. And so the issues on hand are both very much in terms of our planetary boundaries that fashion is pushing up against. Cotton is a thirsty crop. And whether you buy a $20 pair of jeans or a $100 pair of jeans, you're still using the same amount of water. And, the amount of dyes in our clothes, there are a lot of connections to human health that we don't consider. We often might think about the food that we put in our body, but we're not thinking about the clothes and the chemicals that touch them. But as someone that has been in dye houses, I'll tell you, it's nasty stuff. So you've got, fashion's impact on climate, on water, on chemicals, its impact not just from where it starts, but where it ends up. Because we're increasingly buying, millions of units of clothes that we throw away within the first year of purchase. We may think we're doing the right thing by taking it off to Goodwill or a charity shop, but because we're producing so much, most of our clothes then end up in landfills or in the ocean or in secondhand markets that no longer can deal with fashion's waste problem. So you have all the environmental issues. So I'd say if you care about the climate crisis, you care about conserving water, if you're an ocean activist, you care about human health, you would care about fashion. But for me, on a very personal level, being Pakistani American, spending half my life more in the production side of fashion, one of the things that fashion has systematically done is hire a generation of women. So there are some 70 million people that work in the fashion industry. Most happen to be women of color, particularly where our clothes are cut and stitched. And today it's really been a race to the bottom. So the easiest way to think about it is the cheaper our clothes come to us, the more her wages shrink. And so in COVID, for example, garment makers have had to decide, can I put 2 meals on the table or one? And, for a multi-trillion-dollar industry, it doesn't have to be this way. So this race to the bottom not just has massive impacts on our planet, but also on human lives and their dignity. And so for us at Remake, it really is about remaking those connections, back to your closet, for you to know that no matter how much you paid for that sweater or top, the human hands who made that put a lot of labor and love into it. And so we really do have to have a different relationship with our clothes.
You bring up some really important points there, and many of which why it was so enticing for us to dive this deep into fashion, our series, because there's not many issues that fashion doesn't touch on in one way or another.
Right.
And then likewise, just the scale of the industry and how many people are touched and directly impacted and directly involved. I don't know if the figure is exact, but I think it's 1 in 7 people on the planet in some way work within the fashion industry. Something like that, which is obviously quite impactful. But one thing that stood out to me, even as recent as what's become a bit of a story with the legislation passed in California, I was surprised to the extent that these issues with workers are spreading or just spread all over the globe, whether it's speaking to the United States or internationally. So can you paint a picture for us as to where are these factories that people are working in, specifically, with the guise of conditions not being ideal, not being appropriate or ethical? Like, how far is this spread? Where are they in particular? Where are they concentrated?
Yeah. So, with a lot of the trade agreements, what ended up happening is that a lot of our fashion went overseas. And so some 97% of fashion today is made predominantly in Asia, with a big, with a big concentration in Cambodia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. There's some of that. Some of your value-added garment comes from Sri Lanka. So mostly in Asia. But we do have 3% of our clothes today still made in the United States. And for people who care very much about made in America, made in LA, made in USA, it's to know that, historically, most of that concentration has been in Los Angeles. And that's where some 45,000 women, mostly women of color, work in factories. And until yesterday, the conditions were very much sweatshop conditions. I think there's something for people to understand, that we often think the terrible conditions are far away. And if somehow we buy made in America, made in LA, that the workers are better off. But it turns out that in LA, the factories predominantly work on a piece rate system. So that means, whether you're stitching a sleeve or a seam or a pocket, you're paid cents for that task, depending on how quickly you can do it. And what the UCLA Labor Center found was that the average take-home pay for garment makers was somewhere between $2 and $5. And think about how expensive California is. Think about just our everyday life. And it's just unconscionable that here we are in the 21st century with a take-home pay of $2 and $5. And these are people who made our masks and our PPE during the pandemic. And so the Garment Worker Protection Act, which, was shepherded by workers themselves, this is really a worker-led piece of legislation, with the Garment Worker Centers, one of the co-sponsors of the bill. And we came in as allies to say, okay, there's nothing we can do that's more important than getting this legislation passed. And so happy to report that the governor here in California signed this bill, SB 62, into law yesterday. And what this means is that essentially workers are now paid the $14 minimum an hour in California rather than piece rate. The other really interesting thing about this bill is that it pushes for multilateral accountability. And now that's wonky terms to say. Look, the reason we have cheap clothes anywhere in the world results in sweatshop wages is because of the prices the brands pay. And for too long, brands have been able to get away with saying these are not our workers. So whether you're working in a sweatshop in Karachi or in Phnom Penh or in LA, it ultimately comes down to the commercial practices of the brands. And so now, with this piece of regulation, if there is wage theft, which is pervasive in LA, manufacturers and brands will be held accountable. And that, to me, is the way to clean this up. Because if brands don't pay the fair prices, ultimately what ends up happening is that we as taxpayers pick up the cost when workers have to, file with the restitution fund in California. So this bill is really landmark in terms of, the power that this bill is really landmark in terms of being worker-led legislation, but us coming together as a citizen and business coalition to do what's right. And I think really setting up California to be a sustainable fashion frontier, because the future of fashion has to be sustainable. Our our earth and people can't sustain this race to the bottom that we've been engaged in over the last decade.
Mm. And so what has enabled, like what sort of systemic conditions have enabled and allowed brands to be able to treat workers this way, both within the United States and internationally, many of the countries that you mentioned? I think you mentioned, I mean, fast fashion as an industry culture, a model, maybe a lack of regulation. I'd be curious to hear what are you think some of the strongest conditions systemically that allowed brands to not just do this, but as well continue to get away with it, year after year.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a couple of things, right? First, most of our fashion is made by large multinational conglomerates who have no interest or connection to any of the communities where their product is made. And fashion operates in a complex web of suppliers who in turn subcontract, and you've got this web of, where the product is made versus who's buying it, and you've got all these intermediaries in between. And absent of smart regulation like the Garment Worker Protection Act, what brands have managed to do then is essentially outsource all risk and say these are not our workers. And so you've got a regulatory gap. You've got the way the industry operates, which is just pushing all of the delivery pressure, cost pressure onto manufacturers. And then you have really an asymmetry of power. You talk to factories and you ask them, why did you take, this kind of contract? Like, how is it even possible for you to make, this pair of pants or this top for this price point? And factories will tell us, well, if we don't take it, then, the brand will just take it to the guy next door. And because brands' commercial practices are so hidden, you don't have the data around, well, what does H&M or Levi's or Gap actually pay for a pair of jeans or a t-shirt? It's very hard to then hold them accountable. So, we need to tackle this issue in a multifaceted way. We certainly need smart regulation like the Garment Worker Protection Act, not just here in California, but in New York, where we also still have manufacturing, or thinking about this at a federal level. There's mandatory human rights due diligence coming out of Europe now, with this notion that brands should be held responsible for their human rights impact in their supply chain. So partly policymakers are waking up, to recognizing that this offshore model where brands essentially push all risk away, even though it's their practices that are driving their conditions, is not working. But then for us as everyday citizens, there is a culture, especially with TikTok and Instagram, that's just pushing us constantly to be chasing trends. You get that one photo for the gram and then you throw it away without thinking about the human and planetary impacts of those choices. And, the more we buy, the more depressed we get. So I think there's also something that we're needing to do from a counterculture standpoint of, we as Americans don't need all this stuff, and especially when it's disposable things that are going to end up in landfills anyways.
So where do you think that cultural transformation begins? I mean, if the end goal is, as you mentioned, smart legislation and policymakers waking up, they kind of have to be woken up by perhaps something else. So I'm interested from your perspective and experience, where do you think this all begins for us?
So I think, first and foremost, it begins with very small steps. I always love to tell our Changemaker community to not get overwhelmed. We live in this clickbait culture of there's terrible headlines all the time, and you almost want to just, put your sheet over your head and say, I can't do anything. And to know that, little steps do add up to make transformative change. And so it's even, the first step would be have a look at your wardrobe, see what's in there, know that the most sustainable shopping choices are swapping or just staying with what you have and taking better care of your clothes and building that relationship, knowing that, a lot of people put a lot of love into bringing your clothes to life. I will say this, that for a lot of Americans, especially as we teach in universities, there's this sense that somehow if I become a conscious consumer, I'm a good person. And, we are really here to push back on that falsehood, because nowhere in the history of time have we dealt with such wicked problems as we've been talking about by simply just shopping our way into, a more sustainable future. It doesn't work like that. And so partly what we are there to do is to teach people to re-engage in the political process. We had people up and down the country writing postcards to Governor Newsom to urge him to please sign this bill into law, and for him to hear from concerned citizens in California and nationally mattered. At key parts of this bill, we lit up the phones. We had our community call the different legislators to make the case, and to stand in solidarity with government makers. And community told us they sort of got a rush when they're calling a legislator's office or signing a postcard that, oh my gosh, my voice matters. And so much of this is about getting involved locally, statewide, nationally in the policy making process, because a lot of this is the way to make change. If we were to say, you can only buy sustainable fashion, well, a lot of sustainable fashion is quite expensive. And then that would mean that only rich people can be good people. And that's just not true, is it? So, there's something about the capitalistic community and model. There's something about the capitalistic way that we exist today, that there's this sense that somehow everything comes down to us as a consumer and how we buy. And so if I'm zero waste and fair trade and consciously buying my clothes, then I've done my part. Where it turns out that what we have to do is actually work as a collective, and supporting unions and lifting the voices of workers and having our voice heard with policymakers. And so for us at Remake, when we talk about fashion as a force for good, it's essentially reteaching how we can all be engaged citizens and advocates.
I love that. And in that answer there's nothing explicitly mentioned about the responsibility of brands or companies in the fashion industry. And I think that, of course, it's something that's considered, but it does seem, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you think that that's, that is the approach in which we do truly create the more sustainable and lasting change, in contrast to perhaps expecting the brands and the companies to come along first.
Yeah, why would they? I mean, look, think about any large fashion brand, their first and foremost responsibility is to their shareholders. And yes, the investor community is changing, and we do talk about sustainable investing. But the truth is, currently there is a lack of incentives for brands to change their behavior. You've got the regulatory gap. And as long as we think of ourselves as consumers first and citizens second, then brands are just going to send you the little greenwashing, here's our sustainable capsule collection for you to buy something from, and onward they'll go. But if we are to talk about fashion brands are putting out too much product in the world that's pillaging our natural resources, they're not paying enough to factory workers, you're not going to address any of these intractable, pervasive problems without pushing for smart regulation and collective action where citizens and the labor unions come together. Like, that's the only way to drive change. I often get asked this question, who are some of the better brands? Who are some of the worst brands? And people always say, well, why are the little brands the good ones? And it's like, well, because they're privately held and you've got, the owners really wanting to do what's right. But once you're a big publicly traded company, all you're trying to do is make as much profit as quickly as possible. And the incentive structures are not there to address these issues we're talking about. So I think it's quite naive for us to think that somehow brands will do this from the goodness of their heart. We've had 30 years of voluntary efforts, and look where we find ourselves.
Right. I certainly agree with you. And I'm wondering if you could help perhaps paint the ideal for us. I know we've mentioned a few things here or there, more broadly speaking, just better working conditions, whatever that means, increasing wages, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe this connects to the 7 actions that you are calling for with Remake's Pay Up campaign. But just so we understand what it is that we should be looking for, what expectations we should have for how garment workers in the fashion industry should be treated. Could you explain a little bit of what are some of those characteristics or qualities of their working experience, their working conditions that we should call for?
Yeah, COVID was a big awakening, I think, for everyday people to understand just how much of the risk is pushed onto garment makers, right? You talked about the pay up campaign. At the start of the pandemic, the industry made this catastrophic decision to cancel orders where garment makers had already sewed and worked untold hundreds of hours making the product, simply to shore up their balance sheets and show that even if sales are sluggish, we can remain profitable. And it was really workers and us as citizens coming together to say, no, you have to take those goods and workers have to be paid. These are women who are already living paycheck to paycheck. And so at that time, one of the things that we did was we brought together union leaders and workers to say, all right, let's paint a picture of if we are to build back better from this pandemic, what does good really look like? And that's the 7 action points of the Pay Up Fashion Coalition. And, none of this is rocket science, but I think it's the first time we've holistically put together a blueprint of this is what we as civil society, as citizens and garment makers want from the industry. And, when it comes to good working conditions, first and foremost, it's about living wages, right? I mean, in LA, we're still fighting for minimum wages, but what a living wage is not only is this work that's going to assure that I can have meals and afford to go to the doctor if I need to, but I'm lifting a generation of my family out of poverty. I can keep my kids in school. So it's paying, for this labor-intensive work fairly. I think the other piece of this is really around a humane pace of production. With the piece rate and the incentive targets, workers work an average of 10, 11, 12 hours a day, sometimes to make enough money. And so think about that from a quality of life standpoint, right? So what we look at is holistically better working hours and better pay, and then protections to organize, because so many workers around the world, especially this last year when they've been protesting just for wages that are legally owed to them, have been up against police brutality, union busting. And so for us, keeping workers safe is really important. So they're sort of the basic things, how many hours do you work? What is your take home pay? Is it safe for you to organize? And then there's other ways that we in this blueprint talk about what's it going to take to disrupt the system. One of the key things that I'm always astonished about is how sustainability conversations never have garment makers present, the essential frontline workers who can tell you firsthand what the industry is like. And so we're calling for no sustainability engagements or participations of conversations without at least 50% participation from garment makers themselves. Go straight to the source. And then ultimately, this is about fairer contracts that take into account workers being paid fairly, so addressing that asymmetry of power, and smart regulations.
And so is this equivalent with any sort of certification or affiliation that we might see out in the world? Like, what is the relationship between this and what fair trade might look like? Or is this something kind of a completely new standard?
Yeah. So look, certifications have a piece of how they try and address conditions, right? Supply chains are very complex. A lot of brands are headquartered in a different part of the world. They haven't spent time in the cut-sew factories, let alone the mills and, upstream and downstream. And so you have certifying bodies that are going in to say, I'm taking a look and having you, letting you know from a risk standpoint what the conditions are like. Unfortunately, we have seen time and time again that certifications can also result in a lot of just money exchanging hands. There's a lot of corruption in the auditing system because, again, it's a private intervention. It's a private sector intervention, which is why it doesn't work. The auditors and the certifiers are on the payroll of the brands. Their customer is the brand. And so they're really there from a risk mitigation standpoint. And they're looking at the symptoms, but not going to the root cause, right? Why are there children in factories? Why are the working conditions so unsafe? Why do workers work around the clock in structurally unsafe buildings? Why are women robbed of their wages? And it all goes back to the commercial practices of brands. And so unlike certifying or giving you some sort of seal of approval, we are here to really disrupt the conversation, to educate everyday people to ask the right questions of brands who are, very quick to market and greenwash at us. So for us to be savvy in our purchasing and our citizen engagement, and for policymakers to wake up, because the truth is brands paying auditors to monitor their supply chain has not fundamentally left workers any better off.
And so there are brands that are doing this right now, in your opinion?
I mean, if you go to our platform, remake.world, on our directory, we certainly have a rock star category of brands. There's a wonderful footwear brand, Nizzolo, that comes to mind, where they're paying living wages to their factory and really thinking about the environmental and human rights issues. Here in California, there's a wonderful brand called Tonale that not only pay dignified wages to their workers, but are a zero waste brand. So they make everything from remnant fabric. So there are bright spots, but as I mentioned, they're often small. They're in your local communities, and they're not the big mall brands or, the big e-commerce ones that we might know about.
Right. And I mean, maybe that's for the best. I do tend to think that it's the small and maybe mid-sized businesses, Max, that I think have the most kind of character and culture to them. It's nice to know the people behind the brand, which seems to be much more accessible in that context.
Absolutely. It goes back to the, use what you have, buy local, support your local businesses, and then get engaged in the policymaking process.
And so bridging kind of back to this policymaking process, we've mentioned the legislation that was just signed by the governor in California. I think as well there was another a recent milestone with the renewal of the Bangladesh Accord, I think, which has been adapted and expanded. You mentioned the California legislation as something of a landmark. Can you speak more to what moments like these in time and kind of for the movement of more sustainable and equitable fashion, but what do these represent, I guess, along the journey towards that more ideal state for fashion truly being a force for good, as you've mentioned?
So I think, it's an excellent question and really smart, Cory, to connect the Accord and Senate Bill 62, because they have pieces of the puzzle that have historically been missing, right? So as long as we've had voluntary efforts and the fashion industry saying we're going to grow and we're going to be profitable and we're going to take care of all of these issues, we haven't made enough progress, right? And when it comes to the Accord, which was an agreement between fashion brands and labor unions to make factories structurally safe in Bangladesh after Rana Plaza, it worked. Many years after, buildings in Bangladesh have become safer because workers had a seat at the table with the brands themselves. And so for the Accord to expand now to be looking at textile mills and to be looking at another country for expansion, it really is a bright spot to say binding agreements work. When brands have some skin in the game, when they've actually signed something to bring them at the table, not from a voluntary standpoint, we make progress. Similarly, with Senate Bill 62, what you have is multilateral accountability between manufacturers and brands to workers. So again, it's closing that gap between the workforce and the brands from a commercial practices standpoint, because now brands can't pay rock bottom prices because they could be held liable for being in violation of the state's laws, which is $14 minimum. So I think, and my hope is that we see more of this type of regulation and binding agreements, because that has really been the bright spot in all my years of doing this work, is when there is some skin in the game to hold the industry accountable.
And it really seems like those are something of tipping points. If that can exist in California, then perhaps, like you mentioned earlier, we need it in New York as well. Maybe that means that it's just so much more possible if it's done someplace. We can see more of it elsewhere. And so do you believe that to get us there, it then connects back to the advocacy on the consumer side, engaging, ourselves, people who engage with fashion, wear clothes every single day, getting re-engaged back into the political process?
Absolutely. It's going to take a coalition of the willing, and we are off to celebrate with garment makers tomorrow, the press conference celebrating this win. And this really was worker-led legislation. But as allies, as everyday citizens, we can make a difference. And so, this is why on our Instagram, Remake Our World, or on our platform, we make it very easy and actionable for people to engage. It's like, here's a number, here's the script, make a call, so it's a couple of minutes of your time with a profound way of making a difference. And I think that must feel, at least for me, it feels much better than that, purchase I may have made at a whim and then I'm never going to wear again. And it's just going to clutter my closet anyways.
I agree with you 100%. And do you notice any sort of patterns or consistencies among the advocates, any demographic considerations? Is it younger generations, or is it blended for the people that you see engaging with Remake as an example?
Yeah, I often see these studies and I'm very skeptical when there's a survey that says millennials will save us, the Gen Zers will save us, because truth be told, our community is very diverse. I myself am a Gen Xer, so, grandma in the room, but we certainly have a lot of millennials who are young professionals who work in the fashion industry that love fashion. And that's one of the things that we really try and make this an inclusive and accessible community is if you love an industry and you work in it, we'll take you. And who better than you to be using your platform internally to be asking these questions? I will say that more recently, we have increasingly been getting community from the Gen Z generation, middle schools and high schools even reaching out to us. And one of the things that I see that's significantly different is how much the climate crisis looms large for the younger generation that's coming into the movement. So for some of us, we grew up with, the sweatshops and fighting against sweatshops. But for the younger generation, it really is top of mind, this notion that the climate crisis is here and now. The industry is bartering against my future. And I'm amazed at the intersectionality that they're able to see between this is not about just human rights or about the climate crisis. The two issues are completely linked because the very garment makers who are up against these abusive practices are also on the front lines of the climate crisis and, may become refugees in their lifetime. So the fluidity with which they can see these issues is phenomenal. And I'm always excited to head into, a younger generation coming into their advocacy power.
That's a really important thing to take note of. It seems like what might drive different generations into movements will be a different motivation. Obviously, that makes sense just historically speaking. But and likewise, it's nice to pay attention as to these studies and preferences and everything for different generations and see, what that then translates into action. Preferences, do those actually yield what results might come in actions from generation by generation? But that's very interesting to hear and encouraging too, that the demographics around Remake are quite diverse, generationally speaking. And so, Ayesha, I want to be respectful of your time. I appreciate you taking it here in the first place. Before we wrap up, you mind if I ask you a couple quick hit questions?
Sure.
All right. So the first one for you, what's maybe one resource, a book, film, or otherwise that you might recommend to someone listening in this conversation to dive deeper into this world of sustainable fashion?
I'd say my dear colleague Elizabeth Klein's book, Overdressed. She was a fast fashion addict, but then changed her habits, and it's just a very wonderful resource.
Perfect. A next one for you. What's maybe one daily habit or morning routine that you absolutely have to stick to?
So I have to have my hot cup of chai. It's something I've carried with me from Pakistan. And rather than frantically checking email or rushing into my day, I take a moment to be still and enjoy that hot cup of tea. And I think it just centers me for the rest of the day.
That's my cup of coffee for sure. Next one for you. Are there any brands, organizations, or individuals that you think really deserve a shout out for some excellent work that they've done recently in this space of fashion?
Completely. There's first and foremost the Garment Worker Center in LA. They were the co-sponsors of this bill. They have worked round the clock to make this bill a reality. So huge shout out to them. They're such an amazing worker-centric organization. And then I'd have to say Awaj Foundation in Bangladesh. It's run by my incredible friend Nazma Akhtar. She's a former child worker who's worked in the industry and is now there to make the Bangladesh industry more sustainable and ethical. So Awaj does some wonderful work.
Excellent. And last question for you, maybe not so quick hit. What's one piece of advice that you might leave our listeners with? These folks are change makers from all sectors, all over the globe. I'd
say be kind to yourself. Know that self-care is a radical act. The work is long. This is not a sprint. It's a lifelong fight. And as someone who has some years into it, it's something I tell my team constantly. If you are not fueled up, you won't be able to give back. So take the time to do that.
Excellent advice for us to end on. Last item, where should we keep up with you and Remake? Where should we direct folks to go check out?
You can check us out on our Instagram, Remake Our World, or on our platform where there's lots and lots of resources. That's remake.world.
All right. We'll have all things Remake linked up at the show post at girlensemble.com. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.